Okay, so now what we need to do, and you see my file size is now 720, well, it's 540 pixels by 720 because it's vertical. But what's going to happen is that it will render out the proper size whenever I go to make my video, because I'll get to tell it how big it needs to be. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is go ahead and pull up my timeline, and mine's down here, but if yours isn't, you can go to Window, and you can go and find the timeline here. First thing you need to do, well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see more of this. Now you might be asking, well, why don't you just make this smaller? Well, because it needs to be, it's going to need to be bigger. And this isn't the most ideal, you know, size to be viewing it, but I already know that it's going to be okay, because I've already looked through everything. So I'm going to go ahead and create this video timeline. And you see what it does is it grabs all of my layers and the color coding that I put into the layers, and the folders, and it drops them into the timeline. The one thing that it did do, though, that I didn't do, is that it's using this sort of violet color for anything that didn't have a color already. That's fine. All right, so first thing I want to do is think about how it is that I want to animate this. And I sort of already have thought about it, actually, and I've even got my layer comps set up here so that I can just click on them, at least not necessarily to make the timeline work right, but just to kind of get a sense of where it is that I'm going with this whole thing, right? So, and you got to be kind of careful, actually, about using the layer comps at this point. And the reason is that, remember, layer comps are actually going to they're going to actually change the opacity and change the state of positioning and everything, based on the way that those elements were whenever you captured the comp. And if you've made some changes here in your timeline, you kind of don't want that to happen. So, because it can mess your timeline all up. So that's just something to be aware of. All right. So, if you need to pull these back up again, you can, but once we start doing stuff in the timeline, you might not want to monkey around with this because it might be detrimental. There might be some reasons you can use it, but it might be detrimental to you. So I'm going to go ahead and close that just so I'm not tempted to click on it. The reason I like having that, it's not just for this timeline, it was to help me with my own organization, but in a different phase of the assignment. But also, if I want at any time, I can output those comps to JPEG files or to a PDF or something. All right, now let's look at what we're gonna be doing here. So the first thing that we decided is we're gonna start with our base image, and you see here I've got this called 01 and it's got the word base. So if I turn the visibility off of all these other things here, then we've got this base image. And it's going to have 100% opacity throughout the entire film. Now, that means that all of these other ones, if I'm just gradually fading them in, that means that all of the other ones are going to start at 0. Now, the way that that's going to work is that you're going to have these things called keyframes. Keyframe animation is something where you start with a state in one instance of time, and then in several frames later, and these are referred to up here as frames, in several frames later, in a different instance of time, you're going to have a different state on that same element. And so in our case, it's going to be opacity. So you have to use these keyframes to mark these two changes, and then what happens is the application, Photoshop, will animate. It's referred to as tweening. It's in betweening frames. So it's going to tween in between those frames and make that animation happen so that it'll change the alpha state. Okay, so let's go ahead and find that. So we've got, oh, and the other thing that's nice is that if you're accustomed to looking at your panel of your layers over here and you click something, it's automatically going to do the same thing and jump in the timeline. So that's kind of convenient so that you don't get lost and confused and make mistakes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a beginning keyframe for every single other one of these items. And the reason for that is because they're all going to start off at 0 opacity. None of them are going to be visible. So that means that I'm going to have to sort of uncollapse all of these things. And I'm just going to do like maybe a couple to show you what you need to do, and then I'm going to pause it and I'll come back so we don't waste time, you know, having you watch me do the same thing over and over. So if we go to this riverbed bottom folder, inside you'll see that these are the individual layers. And let's go ahead and start with the riverbed bottom that's at the bottom. And normally this does have like a pretty much complete fill. And if I really wanted to, I could, you know, go ahead and have that visible if I wanted to. If I wanted to have that on the very beginning frame, that's how I could make it look. It's certainly more attractive, I think, than just, you know, looking at that. But if we're really trying to show our documentation, then we want to start with just, you know, the plain picture, how you got from point A to Z. All right. Okay, so I'm going to turn the opacity on so I can see what's happening as I'm making changes. Yeah, so if I come in, and the other thing too is that for a folder, you see how it's got opacity for the entire folder? Well, the thing is that I have two different levels of opacity here. So, you know, what I need to really do is not put the opacity keyframe on the entire folder. I need to put it on the individual layers. Otherwise, it's not going to work right. So let's go down here. And this thing right here that I'm dragging, that's the playback head. And here is what's really important. When you have the playback head in a location and you click on one of these little round circle disc looking things for a some sort of keyframe animation, then it's going to put that current state, like the opacity here, it's going to put that current state on the timeline where the playback head is. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I click on this little opacity icon, it gives me a little yellow diamond on the very first frame for the opacity of riverbed, or 0 to riverbed, which is this this layer over here. Now, whenever I go over here and the playhead is still in the same place, for this layer I can also do the same thing. And basically what I'm doing is I'm just setting up an initial state. Now, the initial state is not going to be, we just discussed, is not going to be 50% opacity and 100% opacity on the other one. It's going to be 0% opacity for both. Now, the thing is that I don't want to forget what this was, though. That's kind of important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a decision about where that change is going to happen. So let's say that I'm going to make 1 second in, let's say right about here. I'm going to make it change so that it does go up to its normal opacity. So I move the playhead about 1 second in, and then I can click on the keyframe thing again, little keyframe button for both of those layers. And if I click on this one, you'll see that I've got my 96% opacity for the O2 riverbed, and then for this one I've got my 50%. Now what I can do, so that I've already got those, now what I can do is I can go back to my first frame keyframe, and I can change the opacity there. Okay, and and let me show you something that I just did. I just made a mistake. I'm going to hit undo. I need to move my playback head when I do that. If you don't move your playback head, what's going to happen is it's going to change the keyframe, even though I selected the other one. To me, it seems like a very bad bug, but whatever. It's like a silly flaw, but maybe they'll change it in the future. But I have to actually move my playback head to where that keyframe location is, then select the keyframe, and then change the desired opacity or whatever the thing is that I'm trying to change. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. Now if I come back here, let's check and make sure that it actually kept my other ones. Yes, and it did. So if you wanted to take a peek up here, let me drop this down. If we drag the playback head, you see it sort of gradually is fading in. And if you wanted to check it, you could hit the play button. And be aware that the first time you hit play, it's going to seem like it's a lot slower than it really is because it's buffering everything for the first time. And then if you go all the way back and hit it again, it might be a little faster. And this one's probably not so bad because I did reduce the file size. Had I kept it at 2550 or whatever the crazy number was, it would really chug and you would really have problems getting this thing to do what you think it's doing, what you want it to do versus what you think it's actually doing. So anyway, all right, so what I'm gonna go do now is so you don't have to watch me do it, and you can follow along and do the same thing in your own, if you are doing your own video along with mine, is that I'm gonna go and put all the keyframes in all these other layers on the very first frame, because all of them except for this 01 rooftop painted base, all of them except for that are going to start at 0. But like I said before, I'm not going to actually change the opacity yet because I'm going to forget with all these different ones. I'm going to forget what it's supposed to be when it gets to the place that, you know, I actually want it to have some opacity. So let's go ahead and I'm going to do a couple and then I'm going to pause it. I'm going to collapse this. Now that I've gotten that one out of the way, I'm going to collapse it and move on. So this is the riverbed top 3 or the 03. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with my first keyframe. And then basically the other transition or animation took me 1 second. So if I try to be consistent, then this one's going to be 2 seconds. And if I go in sort of like the 2 second interval, then I should be okay. So let me go ahead then and add another keyframe. And now that I've done that, let's see, I can go ahead and show this now. Now that I've done that, I have my opacity set here, so that's good. Now I can, with my playhead, select this one, and I can lower this opacity down to 0. And now let's see how that looks. And let's hit play. And actually, it kind of didn't seem like it made the transition in the way that I wanted it to, because this second transition is so slight. Maybe it needs to happen a little bit faster since it's not as significant as this 1 second transition. So let's see how that works if I do that. So if I come down to my keyframe, I'm going to put my playhead, instead of at 2, I'm going to put it like just a little bit before. We'll see how that works. Okay, and we'll back that up, hit play. I think I'm a lot happier with that, okay? Okay, so now that you've seen me do 2 of those things, I'm gonna go ahead, so you don't have to watch me, and I am gonna put all the initial keyframes in all of these.